So thank you to Emily, thanks to all the format team, and of course Alys joining us today and all her work leading up to this event. And also thank you to the Hackleberry team for organising this together with us. So as Emily mentioned, I've been the artistic director of Quad for 20 years and co-founder and director of Format for 18 years. Up until recently. Last 6 months, I've moved on to a new role, but very much still engaged with supporting photography and photographers in the development of the medium. And of course, my beloved Format, and I carry on it with my role as patron and do what I can to support kind of the development of our lovely festival. So my new job at Forestry England, Forestry England, for those who don't know already, is the country's largest land manager. We look after over 15,000 forests, 250,000 hectares of land, which is expanding year on year. And we welcome more than 630 million visitors to our forests each year, which is extraordinary. And we care for the nation's forests, for people, nature and the economy. And the foundation of our organisation is sustainable management of forests, which are a living treasure that help us to respond to the challenges that we face in society and the climate. And forests, as you hopefully are aware of, they are vital places for the future of our planet. So it's no mean feat, this new job. Very incredible, very important, and engaged in all our lives. So for health, for well-being, and for storing carbon, reducing flooding and fresh air, etc. Wonderful ecosystems that are really absolutely fundamental to the sustainable future. Our plans go up to 100 years in advance, which is great, very different from other types of arts programming. We're focused on rewilding, reforestation, species reintroduction, climate research and resilience, etc. It's wonderful to be part of an organisation that's making such a proactive, positive difference to the future of our existence on this little planet here. So in this context, I lead on the national and international development of our contemporary art strategy. It's a multidisciplinary arts programme. It's been established since 1968, and it plays a key role in rewilding the imagination, we like to say, and through research, engagement, production, by transecting all areas of work at the intersection between art, science and biodiversity, through exhibitions, major commissions, residencies, many more projects and opportunities. So one significant area of our work to mention in this context tonight is Earth Photo, which is now in its 5th year. It's a major international open call for climate engaged projects, photography series, photographic series, still and moving image. There are awards, touring exhibitions in the UK and internationally, 6 forest sites where the exhibitions take place and galleries, and a range of great events, portfolio reviews, publications, talks, etc. And it's directed in partnership with the Royal Geographical Society, which is an incredible organisation, Parker Harris as well. So our next open call, as a little plug for us, is open in January next year. And I'll share some links to join us on Instagram and join our mailing list. So as we've mentioned, this talk is organised in partnership with Hackleberry Fine Art. Hackleberry was established in 1998, and the London-based gallery in Launceston Place is committed to nurturing long-term relationships with both artists and clients, and it's continuing to evolve and progress through an expanding programme of exhibitions, museum projects and publishing ventures, goodness me. The small group of artists that the gallery is committed to supporting represent the diversity of practice and pushing the boundaries of various media. So do check them out. We'll share the website link in a minute. On to Alys. A short introduction, and I'm looking forward to Alys telling us more about her recent projects. But in short, Alys Tomlinson's projects are often research-led, and she's most interested in the relationship between people and place, exploring themes of environment, belonging and identity. Recent projects have included Ex Voto, which explored Christian pilgrimage sites in Europe, and Mother Vera, which is merging into a feature-length documentary film supported by Sundance. And this is building on one of the pilgrims that she met in Gorobarka in Poland while she was photographing for Ex Voto, another project about convent life in Belarus. And more recently, during lockdown, her series Lost Summer documented teenagers in North London who had their proms and kind of school life cancelled as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Alys lives and works in London. She studied English and anthropology and grew up in Brighton, and many other things to share. So Gli Isolani is one of the latest and largest projects by Alys, and she's spent the last 2 years exploring the lives of islanders in modern day Italy, capturing little known rituals and traditions inspired by paganism, fables and folklore. And these almost theatrical images document traditional costumes and masks preserved and handed down for generations. I'm not going to say much more. I'll leave it to Alys to expand upon all of these things. But really, thank you for everybody coming along this evening. And I look forward to seeing your questions in the chat. We'll pick up on those. And I'll be in conversation with more questions for Alys and thoughts on the work after she's gone through her presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alys.
Thank you, Louise, and thanks, Emily, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now. So let me do this. And okay, yeah, thank you so much. So I am going to talk a little bit about my previous kind of big long-term projects, I guess, before I talk in more detail about Gli Isolani, which is the Islanders, which, as Louise mentioned, is my most recent project. And the three are all really connected in various ways. So that's why I think it's important to give a little bit of background. I'm just going to do 5 minutes or so about these projects, and then we'll go into the presentation and leave plenty of time for a kind of in conversation with Louise at the end. And please do put any questions into the chat and we'll try and address those. But this project Ex Voto, which, as you can see, well, it took me really 4 or 5 years really from start to finish, felt like a real breakthrough in my personal practice. I'd been working as a commercial photographer really for many years, and it was a great sadness to me that I was beginning to really fall out of love with photography. I'd done lots of travel guides for Time Out, for instance. I'd worked a lot for magazines and design agencies, but I felt like I was on this kind of treadmill, and I never really gave myself the space or the time to work on personal projects. And this is a very kind of quick summary of what happened, but basically I kind of decided if I didn't spend more time on personal projects, then I might just lose my interest in photography altogether. So I made a very concerted decision to invest on an emotional and a kind of personal and financial level in personal work. And this was my big kind of personal project, I guess, called Ex Voto, which began in Lourdes in the south of France, which, as Louise said, is a large and very well-known place of Christian pilgrimage. And I can be quite spontaneous when I decide to do things sometimes. So I'd watched this film called Lourdes, which I found very interesting and inspiring, and then booked myself on a kind of funny pilgrim package tour to Lourdes. And actually what was interesting but also difficult for me was, at first I felt like a real outsider, because I was very much from a non-religious, pretty much an atheist background. And there I was trying to take photographs of people who have this very deep and often complex faith. So this was a little bit of a conundrum for me, how I balanced this. And actually what you're not seeing now is the many years of me going and shooting in colour and the images not working. So I had this kind of breakthrough moment early on not early on, actually fairly late in the project, about 2 years after I'd been going there, where I decided to actually slow everything down and shoot in black and white on large format. And these are the resulting images. And what was also very kind of significant to me was that I'd seen all over Lourdes these small and very significant kind of objects that had been left as objects of devotion, which were called ex votos. And I realized I'd seen these all around Lourdes and I hadn't really known what they were. And I realized that these were key to the kind of threads of the project coming together. So these were some of the ex votos. And I then expanded the project from Lourdes, this is a very quick summary, to Poland and then to Ireland as well. And at this point I had 3 strands. I had the portraits, the wider landscapes and the ex votos. And actually what I'd found during my MA, because I'll just move back, I started doing an MA in anthropology of travel, tourism and pilgrimage when I was studying and working on this project Ex Voto in order to enrich my thinking. And it was during that MA that I actually discovered the term ex-voto and what it meant. And then it kind of clicked into place that I'd seen these around at various sites. And I was interested in capturing these landscapes that really didn't have any signs of modernity. There's definitely a kind of slightly formal and austere sense to the portraits. But actually what I was trying to do was kind of express really how I felt when I was in these landscapes. And that became the most important kind of guide to me really throughout this project. So for instance, this is like some kind of dystopian, grim, Brothers Grimm fairy tale type scene. And I was very interested in these slightly odd and unusual scenes, as well as the portraits. And this was a portrait I took of a pilgrim in Grabarka, which is on the eastern border of Belarus. And I remember when I took this portrait, it was incredibly powerful moment for me, because I really felt when I approached this woman who is an Orthodox nun living in Belarus, that she was very much had this kind of luminous presence, and that she was almost looking into my soul. When I took the portrait, I could feel her spiritual strength. But at the same time, what this portrait did was it really slowed me down. And part of the reason it did that was because at this point, I had changed from using a medium format camera to using a large format camera. So there was a real rhythm and a kind of meditative way to the way I worked with this large format camera that very much also changed the relationship I had with the people I was photographing. So there were a series of kind of small breakthroughs, I suppose, that led me to really engage with this work on a deeper level. And actually, this is something I love about photography and the kind of serendipity that it can bring, that this relationship with Vera, this nun, has led to, as Louise mentioned, a feature film, which is supported by Sundance and is going to be hopefully released next year. So these kind of little moments and always these stories that you create can often lead to so much more. Now this project, as I said, I've kind of condensed this into like 3 minutes or whatever, but it was kind of 5 or 6 years of study and research, did lead to this book being published, which was published by Goss Books in 2019, which was obviously called Ex Voto. And I suppose for me, this was a big, if I'm being very kind of honest, it was a moment that was very important to me, because it realized that my personal work did have a place and it did resonate with people. And this very kind of quiet project that I worked on for many years had suddenly found its way into the world. And these quiet and still images did in some way connect with an audience. And that was something I was really uncertain would happen. So that felt like a kind of big moment in my kind of personal journey in photography, but also in terms of the kind of photographic world, receiving images. As Louise said, I then worked on Lost Summer, which was a very short project, just from June to August in 2020. And I guess this was kind of my lockdown project, really. So this was taken just in 12 weeks over the summer of the pandemic, or one of the summers we had. And this was really partly because I couldn't travel for work. I was very frustrated living in London and not being able to go anywhere. So I started looking closer to home. And this ended up being a series of 44 portraits of teenagers who all live in my neighbourhood in North London. And I was very interested in capturing this kind of loss and longing, but also the kind of resilience of these teenagers, because there was a real sadness to me that they'd missed out on these incredibly important and significant moments in their school lives. You know, all their exams were cancelled. They didn't have an opportunity to say goodbye to their friends. Instead, many of them were stuck in their bedrooms. And it was about capturing this kind of listlessness and this melancholy in a sense, but also I was very struck when I met them by this incredible sense of strength that they all had. So that kind of really touched me when I worked on this work. And as I said, like one portrait kind of began to lead to the next. So I started just photographing Jack, who was the first young man in a local garden, a friend's garden close to me. And then it became a kind of word of mouth thing. And I just used to go out with my, again, large format camera, black and white film, kind of in a wheelie suitcase and with a tripod, and just trundled off and met these teenagers who I just thought were really, like, they surprised me in terms of how kind of wonderful they were in terms of their defiance at this very, very difficult time in their lives. So I really enjoyed this because it also made me realize that I don't have to travel to kind of far-flung places to create works. So it made me think about stories much closer to home. It made me think about the representation of teenagers, particularly in London, where there's so much, we're told about all this knife crime and gun crime, which is obviously terrible, and a lot of that exists, of course, but there are also these teenagers who are very devoted to their work. They're very kind of confident in their own way, and they're really wanting to mark their place in the world. And that was really what struck me with these portraits. And again, I was using the natural landscape. So with Ex Voto, with Lost Summer, and also with Gli Isolani, there's very much this continuity of bringing the person into the landscape. So as you can see, there's this kind of framing of the individual. And particularly with this project, it became very important to me, making the portrait, that I was using the natural surroundings. So I was using, this was just Samuel's car park in his block of flats, and I just really liked how the leaves framed him. So I was almost using these natural landscapes as a studio, if you like, to kind of frame these individuals and try and create these very kind of thoughtful portraits. What was quite interesting for me in this project in terms of the process was that there wasn't so much research, because it was actually something that happened quite spontaneously. But what I did do was I didn't edit anyone out of the project. So I photographed 44 teenagers, and all 44 of them were included in the book and the project. And the reason I did that was because they'd had such a kind of terrible, tough time already, that I just felt that it would be awful for some of them not to be in it. So although I'm aware and I feel that some portraits are much stronger than others, for me it was very important that no one was excluded. And they all got a copy of this book, which was self-published, called Lost Summer. And they also got a print to have, you know, something to have kind of tangible that I hope they will look after and treasure. And what was particularly wonderful about this project for me was that the reaction from the teenagers, so many of them were really incredibly kind of grateful to have been given this time and this attention to really express themselves. So that was a kind of unexpected project that came about in the summer of COVID that we all remember so well now. This then led, I suppose, to what we were talking about earlier, which is Gli Isolani, which is the islanders. And apologies for my Italian pronunciation if there's any Italians listening. But this takes my work in a slightly different direction, I suppose. And actually, often how my projects begin, it's with a kind of seed of an idea. So it's something that I think about, or I've been thinking about for a long time. And often I write down ideas on my phone or in notebooks. And actually this project first came into my head, if you like, 15 years ago, because I was on an assignment for Time Out when I was doing the travel guides, and I had to photograph Venice for Time Out, which was obviously a great opportunity. It was very exciting. But I was also kind of questioning, how do you make Venice unusual in some way, or how do you represent Venice in a different way? And for the Time Out travel guide, I was given this huge list that I had to work through. It was very much a kind of commercial commission, and I was sent to all the typical tourist places. But what really stayed with me was that I was sent to this place here, which is a cemetery in the Venetian lagoon called San Michele. And I remember when I went to get the Vaporetto, which is the boat that, of course, you use because there's no cars on the island. You know, it's all boats. I went to get the Vaporetto over to San Michele, and I remember waiting on the kind of at the entrance to the boat, and it was a very misty day. And I remember there were Venetians there all clutching these bunches of flowers, and they were going to lay flowers on the graves of their loved ones. And it was just an extremely kind of evocative and touching moment for me that really stayed with me. So for years, I thought about going to San Michele and photographing maybe mourners. But then I really started questioning my integrity, like what gives me the right to photograph other people in grief? And is this really what I want to be doing? So that led me to then research Italian kind of fables and folktales, and I came across this book by Italo Calvino, which was really kind of fundamental in my thought process, and it covers many folktales across the whole of Italy, including Venice, so in the north, but also including islands to the south. So I started really thinking about what it means to be an islander. You know, where do our identities stem from? What makes us who we are? Is it the people we're around, or is it the places that we visit, or is it the memories that are ingrained in us? So I started having all these thoughts, and I decided I would first of all think about photographing islands in the Venetian lagoon. And as you can see here, this is an example from a notebook and sketchbook that I had. And this actually became, this was a very good process for me because it became part of a prize, which sadly I didn't win, called the Prix Elysée, but it's a prize that encourages artists and photographers to submit works in progress. So if you already have a kind of grain of idea, it really helps you develop that. So these are some spreads from the book. And through this process of being one of the nominees for the Prix Elysée, I began to look at literature, and I began to look at poetry, and I began to really study the history of Venice and also some of the Venetian islands. And I think for my kind of thinking process, it's really important that I immerse myself not just in photography. So as you can see, there's some references here from books about Venice. There's also some poetry that I found about Sicily. And when I started looking at the islands, these kind of guided me in a different direction. So there was a lot of research involved, there was a lot of thought involved, and I was very keen that I wanted to still keep Venice kind of as part of the project. But I was also aware that Venice has been photographed so many times. It's very, very hard to be at all original in terms of photographing Venice and its environs and even its people. So that's when I started looking at Sicily and Sardinia as potential locations to photograph. So through this kind of reading and research, and this was over, a kind of quite a long period of time as well. It wasn't just that I read a book on fairy tales and then went to Sicily and Sardinia, but I started researching these various festivals and celebrations that happened at different points throughout the year, particularly in Sicily and Sardinia. Now, at first, I thought what I was going to do was I was going to go over to these islands during Holy Week, which is Settimana Santa, and to try and photograph some of the costumes and the masks. These were incredible outfits and costumes that I was seeing through my research. But of course, what happened with COVID was that all the festivals got cancelled. I was also aware at this point that, as I said, with photography, everything's been done, but I always kind of say it's about doing it your own way. So I was very aware of the work of Charles Frager, who did like Wilderman or Wilderman, and photographers like Cristina Garcia Rodero, who's Spanish, who photographed many of the festivities and celebrations in parts of Spain, particularly Galicia. So I was aware that this had been done before, but I was also thinking about how to approach it more from my personal point of view. And that's where two kind of things shifted. First of all, for the first time, and I'd never done this before, I actually worked with a fixer. So I found this woman, you can see her here, she's standing on the rock with the kind of pink t-shirt and the cardigan. I'm taking a light meter reading of her. This woman called Giovanna Stoponi, who is an incredibly talented documentary film producer who lives between Palermo and London. But she has the brilliant kind of combination of persuasiveness and charm. So what happened was I started putting together an itinerary of the communities I would really love to photograph, and she would then get in touch with them and see if they would be prepared for me to photograph them away from the festivities. And also that gave me a kind of level of control that I wouldn't have had in the carnivals and festivities, because many of these carnivals are completely crazy in terms of they're raucous, they're chaotic, there's lots of drinking, and it would have been very difficult to have made these portraits. So I decided instead that I would take a much slower approach, as I did with Ex Voto and as I did with Lost Summer. And I was again very interested in kind of weaving in the thoughts that I'd had when I'd been reading, particularly the Italo Calvino book. And in this, he talks about the infinite possibilities of mutation and the unifying element in everything. So in men and beasts and plants and things. And that really kind of solidified this idea for me that it was not just about the people and communities. It was obviously also very, very much about the landscape around them and how these relate to each other. So in the end, over 2 years, actually, I ended up exploring traditions and costumes on the islands of some of the islands of the Venetian Lagoon, and then much further south and west in Sicily and Sardinia. And these are again some spreads from the Prix Elysée book. So the Prix Elysée published a book, which I think is really wonderful because it really uncovers the process that photographers and artists go through, which is not always very explicitly expressed, I think. Often you see final projects and you don't really know what's happened before. How did this work get made? What was the inspiration behind it? And for me, it just really unearths and kind of unravels some of those questions. So these, as you can see, these are some examples from the Pre-Élysée book where I almost kind of showed the contact sheets, really. And what had happened during the process of making this work was that I had come across this really wonderful quote from a book that I'd read called The Stone Boudoir. And I'd read in that book that the woman who wrote the book had come across this inscription written on the bell of a church in Sicily. And it said, "I cast out demons, I calm the storms, I call to the living, I cry for the dead." And for me, that really kind of summed up what I was trying to say through these images, which was that I was trying to kind of imagine these worlds of good and evil and the sacred and the profane, and these kind of overlapping themes and the almost the mythic, but also the real, and how we move between fact and fiction in our own imaginations. And I realized that actually a lot of these kind of characters that I was hoping to photograph were almost like characters that we'd met in our own imaginations, sometimes from our dreams and sometimes from our nightmares, for instance. And they've all got these very kind of complicated stories, partly because of the, you know, the rich history and the complex history, of course, of many of these islands. So what I kind of found, and I realized through making this work, that I am very influenced and led often by communities who often I don't really have any prior knowledge of. So with Ex Voto, it was about sacred spaces, and it was about faith, and it was about this deep feeling of belonging in terms of how faith can kind of structure that and create that. That was very alien to me, in the same way that these communities were, where tiny little villages in hilltops in Sicily and Sardinia would gather together to celebrate, really, to celebrate life, but also to celebrate the seasons and to celebrate really who they were and express what was very much innate to them. And I realized through making this work just absolutely how deeply proud these communities are, and how the individuals within these communities hold on so dearly to these traditions, which are obviously traditions that have in some cases been around for hundreds of years. So this contact sheet, for instance, this is just one screen grab of contact sheet, gives you an idea of the kind of differences in costume that I was photographing. And there's also a more kind of performative element to these photographs, and a much more theatrical element than to my previous work. So I know this doesn't seem particularly radical, but for me, it's a little bit of a departure that I'm photographing groups, I'm photographing pairs, and there's these particular kind of stances that they're expressing through their body language and through the stature of them. And it was a different way of working for me, because in terms of, I would make up this kind of list of places I would really like to visit, and then I would go there with Giovanna and we would recce the location, and then we would photograph the people who would dress up especially for us. So amongst the kind of crazy and fascinating costumes, there's also within the book and within the project itself, there's these much quieter moments. So for instance, this, as you can see, is a confessional. So I found this on a small island in the Venetian lagoon, a really tiny but kind of beautiful church. And I suppose I'm also interested in these spaces that on the one hand represent something very private and sacred, but on the other hand are these kind of sources almost of revelation and secrets. So these kind of hushed spaces where we never really know quite what's going on. These are the kind of spaces that I'm really drawn to, that contain these kind of stories that are untold, I suppose. And I'm trying, as part of my process, to discover what these stories are, to discover for myself, but also through my photography. So I met some real characters, as you can see, during this project. So for instance, these are the Merdeles, and they represent the farmers' challenges, but also what's difficult to understand, not difficult to understand, but what's not always easy because it's not clear, is where these costumes originate, because there are many kind of contested narratives. So when I was working on this project, I would go to the local bar or cafe and they'd say, oh, the Merdeles are about the relationship with the land and the difficulty they have with the land, and that's why they've got these kind of wooden masks, because they're hiding from the land. And then someone else would say, no, it's about the power of the land and the difference between good and evil. So it's very difficult to identify the exact origin of many of these costumes. And I found that very interesting, that within these, even these very small and tight-knit communities, the narrative is not clear in terms of the origins of many of these costumes. But these guys, as you can see, I mean, it's funny because they kind of turn up looking, that one of them, I think, was a builder, and the other one was actually a shepherd. And then they put on these outfits and they're kind of embodying these completely different, very striking characters with these kind of anthropomorphic wooden masks and these white sheepskins and these black neckerchiefs. And I think when I was making this work, I was also often reminded of fairy tales and stories from my own childhood. So I've often read about some of these kind of characters, but I've never met them or encountered them before. So for me, it was a little bit like meeting these people for the first time in the flesh. And as well as the costumes, in terms of the kind of mask costumes, I also photographed some very beautiful, like this one, traditional costumes. So this young woman is from Piana degli Albanesi, which is a small commune on this kind of mountainous plateau in Sicily. And it's home actually to the biggest community of Italo-Albanians in Italy. So of course, particularly with these islands, there's this clash at times, but also this, in other ways, they are embracing these different cultures and histories that have all kind of collided and come together on these islands. And the intricacy of these costumes was really amazing. And what was particularly kind of moving to me was that when I photographed this young woman, she was actually dressed by her grandmother, her nonna, and her mother. And actually her mother and her nonna had worn these costumes in decades before. So often these costumes are passed down through the generations, and they become like very, very kind of precious objects within the community and the individuals. So most of the book and the project is portraits, but to kind of create these breathing spaces, I also have photographed landscapes. And what kind of worked quite well, I felt, during the project was this move from the north of Italy, which is it's more conservative in some ways, it's more conventional in some ways, but then to these kind of wild and rugged, almost untamed landscapes of Sicily and Sardinia. So they provide kind of spaces in terms of the sequences of the book, but also within the project itself. So the portraits really become kind of broken up by these landscapes. There's so many I've taken, but these are some other of my kind of favorites, I suppose, the Sonaggios from Ortueri in Sardinia. And these are young men. Again, these are men who often have very, normal jobs, but many of them work on the land. So there is obviously this kind of question of how long these traditions can last, and are they always going to be part of these communities? But what really surprised me, and struck me in a good way, was that many of the young people there are really keen on preserving these traditions. So they also take part in these festivities, and these costumes, for instance, I mean, it's incredible, this huge cowbells they have hanging off their back, and the cowbells are supposed to signify obviously the central role of cattle and the kind of pastoral in their everyday lives. And actually there was about 10 of them who kind of turned up wearing these sheepskin costumes with these shiny black boots and the headscarves, and they danced through the village, and it was a really wonderful kind of spectacle to witness, because they had the bells kind of clanging and clashing, and it was an incredible thing to witness in person, very striking. And at that point, I think I just felt so privileged to be able to photograph these people from these communities. So going through a few more, these are some women in Sardinia, and they dress in these very intricate handmade costumes and veils that represent birth and death and the union between these two individuals. So what I was kind of drawn to was that some of these costumes were a little bit sinister, they were quite dark, but they also represent these themes that are really universal to all of us. So there's this kind of oscillation between the lightness and the dark, and you could also perhaps call it between hope and retribution. And there's a lot of influence there in terms of the significance of man and the seasons, and many of these are expressed in the costumes, but also in the landscapes. These guys, this is probably like the hardest photo I've ever taken from a technical point of view, because I was kind of balanced on the precipice of a rock face, watching these two who are called the Coriolos, kind of lock horns. And at that moment, I think I just felt like really a part of this quite surreal world, but I also felt incredibly privileged to be kind of let into this world, let into these rugged landscapes, and let into these kind of ancient and quite atavistic rituals that are really at the heart of many of these communities. But as you can see, they've got these huge deer antlers kind of protruding from their heads. And actually, although, you know, you see the photo there and it's, I think, in focus and it's all, the lighting is nice, I remember thinking, what on earth am I doing when I took that photograph? Because I was balanced on the edge of a rock with a tripod, with a cloak over my head. It was really, really hot. The sun was kind of beating down. And at that point, I did kind of question, is this worth it? But hopefully it is. These are guys called the Diavoli, so the devils. And actually in the book, there's a really lovely essay by a writer called Sabrina Mandanici, and she talks about how they look more like the wild things in search of their jungle. And I love this sense of kind of discovery, that you discover these characters and you don't quite know where they've come from or in fact where they're going, but there's something so engaging about them. And what I did feel when I was making this work was that these locals were really embodying these characters, and this was something that was incredibly important to them. Just moving on quickly to another devil. And I suppose with all my work, I'm really trying to make something that maybe timeless is overused, but something that feels otherworldly, that you've entered this world that you would never even really be aware of if it wasn't for the photographs. And actually Sabrina in her essay talks about how pagan and religious, masked and exposed, collapses time in front of your camera. And for me, that was wonderful that she saw that in the images, that you don't know quite when they've been taken, you don't quite know what world you're inhabiting or what world they're inhabiting, but there's something quite kind of seductive about that in a way. And it's this kind of merging of the magical and the mystical and the ominous and the odd, and all these things and elements kind of coming together. So these are a couple of images. I'm going to wrap up in a minute, so we've got lots of time for an in-conversation, but a couple of images from the installation that is currently at Hacklebury Fine Art in London, which is open until November the 5th. So if you're interested in seeing the work in person, then please do come along. Everyone's very welcome. And then this project has also resulted in a book, again published by Ghost, which is out actually in the next couple of weeks. So anyone who's pre-ordered should receive it very soon. But for me, it's an immense kind of privilege to be able to have my work published. And it's something obviously that I hope people will look after and refer to. And in this book, also the images are contextualized by this essay, which is in Italian and English. So it was very important to me to keep it kind of dual language. But I think the thing that really stays with me making this work is that the images are kind of, there's an energy to these rituals and to these traditions that really says kind of we're here and we're alive. And I think that was something that I was trying to capture, even through very slow photography and kind of quiet photography in a sense, but to capture something that really encapsulates these deep traditions that are so important to the communities that I met. Right, I think I'm not going to stop sharing my screen, but maybe Louise can hop on and we can.
I'm back. Thank you, Alys. That's really mind-blowing. It's an incredible series, and I really love hearing you talk about the work and seeing some more of the images. I can't wait to see the book itself and kind of really delve into this mysterious and otherworldly existence where past and present and cultural traditions converge. The images come across almost as mythical, you know, the really gorgeous wild landscapes and you know, fiction and reality and nature combining, and also from the documentary perspective, kind of engaging with something that still persists and people are still engaging with, and the possibility of witnessing that within our lifetimes is incredible also to engage with. So I just wanted, just before we kind of delve deeper into your life and work as a freelancer, photographer, human being, are there any other images that you'd like to, I suppose, go back into and kind of flag up any kind of behind the scenes stories that we wouldn't otherwise access through reading the book? Something about I suppose the photographic process and the staging, or the people and individuals, the kind of multi-dimensional situations that occur beyond the page.
Yes, probably what I should have, I can't remember if I said it now, but working with a fixer, which was different for me, what we had this itinerary, so actually we would almost go to a different village every day, and rather than, you know, in contrast to, for instance, ex voto, where I'd be waiting around at these sacred sites that were sometimes very busy but other times very, very quiet, I would wait for hours and hours to kind of see if there was anyone I was interested in photographing. This was much more, this was set up essentially in terms of that they were wearing their costumes especially for us. And what kind of worked in our favor in a way was that because many of them hadn't worn the costumes because all the celebrations like Holy Week and the other big celebrations had been cancelled, they were very excited about the idea of a photographer coming over from the UK and photographing them. So they kind of, you know, almost unlocked their kind of treasured costumes, especially for us. And it also gave us an opportunity to kind of do a recce in terms of location spots. So that's what allowed me to find these like crumbling stone kind of backdrops and the hills and the mountains. But this one was quite funny because, I mean, these are quite ominous, these guys. Well, they look it anyway, they look quite sinister, but actually during the celebrations, they kind of run around the village, like blowing, I think they're cornets or horns, they're brass horns, and causing chaos in the village. But then there's this very ominous edge where they have the kind of cross on the tongue of their masks, and they have horse tails hanging down. But what was quite funny about this one was that, you know, I always think I go to these like fairly obscure places, and I don't know how many other people have kind of photographed them. And when I went to this one, they were very nice. They were all lovely. I have to say also the Italian hospitality is just completely amazing. They were just wonderfully welcoming. But I got here and they were all dressed up looking quite scary. But then, of course, they were these lovely people underneath their costumes. And they were telling me how another photographer had come just the week before to photograph them. So immediately you're like, oh God, you know, you try and do something, you know, vaguely original, and someone's already been there the week before. So I kind of thought, I wonder if it's someone like local. And I said, oh, who was it? And they said, oh, it was Mario Testino for Vogue. And I was like, oh no, because you know, one of the world's biggest photographers had been there the week before. But I think he shot in colour and it was for Vogue, so it was a very different way of working. But this is what I try and tell students, because we're all looking for this almost kind of this idea that has never been done. And I kind of think at this point everything's been done to a degree, but it's about doing it in your way. And for me, it's very much about how I feel in a place. And this is also as a result of my anthropology, that somehow comes through in the images. It's actually to do with a very kind of personal connection I have with people and place. And that's also what I'm trying to express when I'm making these images.
Yeah, and it must be how it fits within obviously the project and the wider project and the trajectory of your career and your focus as an artist in particular as well. I just wanted to delve into the photographic process as well. You touched on it a little bit, but using the large format plate camera, the practicalities of working abroad with that, and bringing your materials with you, or how do you tackle that, and what do you think it brings in terms of the relationship with your subjects? You're often working with human beings, and the spectacle, the performative element of it, and also how did you learn the process specifically? Such a unique way of working.
Yeah, so it brings with it a lot of anxiety. Because obviously I'm working when I'm in these remote villages, it's not possible for me to develop film as I go along. So there's always for me, oh gosh, have I loaded everything the wrong way up, or is it all going to get ruined in the X-ray machine when I go back through the airport? Why am I doing this? Why am I not shooting, digital? So that, particularly with this project, where I felt there was a lot of pressure just on myself, but I'd spent a lot of money on, obviously it's very expensive shooting large format film. You don't get many chances to get it right. So I was really questioning my process. But then on the flip side of that, I do feel, and I've always maintained, that it really changes the relationship I have with my subjects, in a positive way for me. So even from the teenagers who had never seen like this huge cumbersome camera before, who just, you know, used to taking selfie shots, they were amazed by it. They were really kind of engaged with the process. And then the villagers who I photographed for Gli Isolani as well, you know, many of them had never seen this type of camera, and I think they really kind of appreciated the amount of time that goes into making images with this camera. You know, it's not a quick process. You have to set it up, you have to be very methodical, you have to be very precise. People have to stay still for you. You have to direct them to an extent, because it takes a long time to focus the camera. So I think on the whole, I mean, I love it because it makes me think in a different way, and that's the main reason I use that camera. But I also feel like it brings a kind of deeper connection to the people who I'm photographing. So I actually engage with them in a different way, which is why I continue to work in this way on a large format camera with black and white film. And maybe, again, I'm creating this myth around large format. Maybe I could get exactly the same results with the digital camera. But for me, it just absolutely slows me down. And I operate in a different way when I'm using that camera, as opposed to my commercial work where I'm using digital and I'm photographing endlessly. So yeah, it allows me to kind of reach a deeper level of connection, I would say, without meaning to sound too pretentious.
And can you share with us, I suppose, technically, what kind of large format camera are you working with? Is it an ancient box camera, or have you something more contemporary?
So I started off with, when I shot ex voto, I used a Sinar, which is traditionally a studio camera. So to be honest, I looked a bit of a wally, like lugging this thing around, because it was on a monorail, which I had in like a Muji suitcase, and I just take out this whole like monorail and stick it on a tripod. It wasn't really designed for being mobile or for being carried around like that. And I also worried that I was going to kind of do my back in. So I more recently invested in a Chamonix, which is a folding field camera. So it's a lot lighter, and it's much more mobile, much lighter, but obviously it's still 5.4. So essentially with the same lens, you get the same results. And in terms of teaching, I kind of taught myself large format, really. I mean, I did do one really great workshop with Paul Ellis at PhotoFusion a few years ago. PhotoFusion in Brixton in London, they do a series of workshops, and that was a really great workshop. It gave me kind of confidence to carry on, but a lot of it was self-taught, trial and error, watching videos on YouTube. I mean, in many ways it is quite simple, but you do have to have a lot of patience, and also I don't use so many tricks with the tilt and shift and that kind of stuff. So I mean, I just still don't feel like a hugely technical photographer, but I kind of feel that I know I'm confident using that camera. I know what works and what doesn't in terms of the kind of images that I'm trying to capture. And obviously I do love this kind of wonderfully rich tonal depth you get, and also this lovely depth of field that we can achieve with cameras, but that I feel that it works particularly well. And the detail that you get from a 5.4 negative is obviously really, really beautiful and very rich. So there are kind of many reasons for choosing this. I don't know if I'll always work on this format, but I would like to think that I will for a while longer.
That's really incredible to understand. We're getting close to running out of time, but I just want to ask about I suppose for other photographers out there, something around keeping motivated, building up a team, the importance of persistence, resilience, managing time, coaching your confidence, growing from failure, something in that territory in terms of being a freelancer. It can be a very solitary, it all comes down to you and your ideas at the end of the day, and keeping motivated and having, worked for several years in a career and multiple projects now. Obviously you kind of have a track record, but it doesn't change feelings day to day or things like that, and kind of charting this territory. If you've got any reflections on things I suppose you would like to have known when you were starting out, or some comments on this sort of area?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, well, it's still really tough for everyone, so I can't pretend that 20 years down the line, however long it is, that it's now easy. And you know, still financially it's a struggle. Funding my own projects is still difficult. So you know, that's something I'm happy to be really honest about. I think also, I mean, I think my many years working particularly on my own as a travel photographer made me very independent and very resourceful, and that's certainly helped in terms of my personal projects as well. So I think they can, I don't think the two worlds are completely exclusive. Like, I think working as a commercial photographer can feed into your personal work in quite a useful way in lots of ways. But it's still, you know, what do I wish I'd known? Well, I mean, I think actually on the whole, the photo world is not as scary as it can seem from the outside. And there are really, really good people, really supportive people who are wanting to help, who are willing to mentor, who are very open to offering advice. And I suppose I found a kind of, not gang exactly, but, you know, a group of like-minded photographers and people in the creative world who are happy to share ideas and share opinions, and you know, we'll get together and we'll have kind of informal crits and that kind of thing. So when I was starting out, I was in a collective called Photo Debut, and many of the photographers from that are actually now very well known. But I think we really established a kind of community between us that worked very well as emerging photographers at that stage. In terms of the rejection and competitions, I mean, I've been lucky in terms of competitions in some ways, but I've also had, I mean, it's a good example, the Taylor Wessing Private Views actually tonight for the latest 2022 prize. But, you know, I had years of not getting into that, years of feeling like a failure, that I wasn't making good portraits. I would always get to the final stage and not get in. Do the kind of walk of shame with my rejected prints. You know, a lot of us have done that, and it's hard not to feel demoralized by that and disheartened. But I think, I mean, it sounds really cliched, but I think if you continue to make the work you believe in, and you're kind of open to the world, and you're open to ideas developing, and you're always pushing the way you think, you know, good work will result in being recognized eventually. And, you know, after years of rejection, I won the prize with the Lost Summer 2 years ago, which was fantastic, and I was never expecting that. But I'd never make work thinking really how it's going to end up. So I never make or start a project thinking, oh, this could be good for that competition, or this could be a great book. You know, I'm kind of driven to make the work mainly out of curiosity, and then if it leads to anything more, and hopefully people, you know, respond positively to it, then it's able to reach a wider audience. And that for me is a very kind of positive outcome. But it's really hard. I mean, there's no easy answer, because even at whatever stage you're at, I think it's very hard. And, you know, having Hacklebury as a gallery, they've been incredibly supportive, and that allows me another avenue to show my work, and it brings work to a new audience, particularly if they're at photo fairs and that kind of thing, and international fairs. So that's been a really wonderful experience for me. But I almost feel like as a photographer now, you have to do many different things. So a lot of photographers teach, they have galleries, they might have stock photography, they do commercial work, they do print sales, they do their own projects, and it's like trying to fit it all together. It's like trying to balance it and kind of put these jigsaw pieces together, which is always challenging. But at the same time, I would never do anything else now. And I'm so glad many years ago when I was going to like give it all up, because I felt I'd really fallen out of love with photography. I'm so glad that really that personal project like reignited something in me and really compelled me to carry on making work.
Yeah. And are you still juggling commercial? Obviously we've been through the pandemic, which knocked things out of the way, but is that starting to come back now, and you're kind of juggling your personal projects and commercial commissions alongside each other again?
Yeah, I am. I mean, ideally I would like to get more commissions that are along the line of work, of my personal work, I suppose. At the moment my commissions feel quite separate because I use a different camera, it's a different kind of headspace I'm in. It's stylistically completely different. So I would like for them to come together more, but that's pretty difficult to do that. So yeah, I am still working commercially, because I have to be realistic that, you know, a life as purely as an artist is probably not really possible financially for me at the moment. But, you know, perhaps in the future. But it's kind of a long game. So we'll see. But definitely, I had to make that decision many years ago that actually I would put my personal work ahead of my commission work, and there were certain sacrifices that I would have to make in order to do that I decided that was what I needed to do at that point if I was going to continue doing something that I loved.
Thank you. So the last question for me, a bit of a combo question, and then we'll go to Emily for some of the audience questions in the chat. So I'll try and combine this, and hopefully it won't be too lengthy for you to answer. Obviously, we're kind of keen on your insight into this. So just talking about publishing and publishers, top tips on book projects for people who may or may not have made one before, or you know, a lot of people self-publish, but collaborating with a publisher is another dimension, and also crowdfunding in the context of that.
So yeah, I mean, my experience of the publishing world, I've now done 2 books with Ghost, who are an independent photo book publisher, and then last summer I self-published. I'm very lucky because my boyfriend, who's next door, is a graphic designer, so I was able to exploit his experience and talent in order to collaborate with him on the book. I think anything more ambitious, I would go to a publisher again because of their marketing, their distribution. They take the books to fairs. They just have a much wider network. The problem with self-publishing is you're doing everything yourself. You're a bookshop, you're doing the press, you're going to the post office every day, you know, you're managing the PayPal account or whatever. And some photographers do that very well, and some photographers do make money from that. Not very many, but some do. But the problem that I do have with photo book publishing is the immense fees that many of them now require. So with very few exceptions, most photo book publishers, even if they're interested in the work and they're enthusiastic about the work, they will ask the photographers to stump up an enormous amount of cash. Like we're talking 20 grand plus. And that's why photographers are having to resort to do crowdfunding, Kickstarters, because who's got 20 grand in their account? Like very few people spend on a photo book. So this for me is actually an issue and a problem within the photo book publishing world. And I don't really know if there's an easy answer or how it's going to get solved. I mean, part of the reason is that publishers, photo book publishers, they're not making loads of money on the whole, and they are not willing to take any risks. So if the photographer covers all the costs, they don't even have to sell a single book, really. You know, they're not gonna be losing money. But it's difficult. It's not a model I support, but at the same time, I've done it twice now, because I know what a publisher can bring to your work. And for instance, with Goss books, you know, you're bringing a wealth of experience. Stu Smith is a really great designer. He's brilliant at sequencing. You've got a kind of support team there who will promote your book, who will take it to the fairs, you've got Eleanor McInerney, who's brilliant at the press, who's been working in photo book press for years. So it comes with a whole team. So for me, there are many advantages to photo book publishing, but I don't know what's going to happen kind of within the industry, because I feel like this is a big problem, and it's not really something that should be promoted. I don't think it's fair on the photographers. But at the same time, many of us are, you know, we're agreeing to things, or we are not really helping the industry by becoming a part of that system.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to understand who to choose to be part of your team as well as a photographer, and what risks to take and what may or may not work out. Obviously, learning from failure or challenge is something, isn't it? You can move on or stay with somebody as a result of taking that leap, but you have to keep active and do things and try things, and you know, trust is a big part of that. And obviously, you know, all our money is tight, more or less, so making the wise choice is important.
I should say that these publishers aren't making like millions of pounds. You know, they're not sitting there in this like their mansions like sipping expensive wine. Like it's difficult for everyone. So although it's a model I don't really want to support, like at the moment things are hard across the board. Like my printers in Italy, you know, their energy bills have gone up like 5 times. They're struggling. You know, paper suppliers struggling. So it's difficult, yeah. But I also think, depending on the project, self-publishing can be, you know, really fulfilling and really successful for photographers. But you kind of also have to know what you're doing, and that's where things like book workshops are really helpful. So now I've seen more. Not just publishers, but also independent people offering workshops on books, on sequencing, on how to market a book. And I think all that kind of stuff is really, it kind of demystifies the whole process, I think, which is very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And around crowdfunding, there's a lot you can learn from seeing how other people with their successful or unsuccessful campaigns do things, in terms of what they offer and how much time it takes really to build up those you know, the the story to tell, the videos to share, the relentless social media posts, the things that you're offering, and then at the end of the day posting them all out by hand and all the rest of it. So all the practicalities.
I would say for the crowdfunding that it's absolutely imperative to do your research and to have a base of people you're ready to contact, because the ones that fail are people who just launch it without really thinking it through. And actually it's an immense amount of work, and you can't just stick a video up there and hope you're going to have thousands of pounds kind of reach you. Like, you really have to be quite strategic about your approach. And it's really, I mean, things like Kickstarter, what is useful is that they have everything archived, so you can look at projects that did brilliantly well. You can also look at projects that didn't reach their funding, and it's quite easy to really work out why, because you can see the ones where a lot of time and thought have been put into it, and you can see ones where perhaps they were rushed, or the photographer particularly hadn't really thought things through. So that's quite useful as a way of seeing what works and what doesn't, and as a kind of archive there, that everything is kept up.
Yeah, and there's always the potential to reach out to the individuals that manage those things as well, and ask them for any things to avoid or top advice. I'm just going to hand over to Emily, because there's some really fantastic questions coming through in the chat, and let's give a chance for our wonderful audience to feed them through. So thank you, Alys. Really wonderful. Love talking with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. That was amazing. I'm very conscious we're running slightly over, but like Louise said, there are some really interesting questions in the chat. So I'm going to take it right back to a question we had a little bit earlier on. And that was regarding ex voto. So it's Tom says, beautiful portraits. Was it difficult to approach subjects, break down the barrier to persuade people to sit for portraits? Were the subjects reserved or welcoming to share their story? I imagine religious communities being quite protective of their way of life.
I mean, so with ex voto, it did take, sorry, I've got the chat there anyway. Can you still see the screen okay?
Yeah. You can, yeah.
Okay. With it, I mean, ex voto was 5 years from start till finish. So that was a long project with a lot of time spent. A lot of it was about, earning trust, really. So, I mean, I went to Lourdes I can't even remember if I mentioned that was where I started the project, Lourdes in the south of France, which is the very famous place of pilgrimage, Christian pilgrimage in the south of France, in the Pyrenees. And I went there several times a year for many years. So it did actually get to the stage where I was timing it to coincide with certain pilgrimage groups who I knew were going. So in the end, they did get to know me. And actually, I brought an assistant with me because she was brilliant at different languages, and my French and Spanish and Italian is not so good. So that was a case of, I don't know if I say tenacity, but like commitment, like going back and back and back, earning people's trust, understanding how this place worked, which was a very kind of a place that was quite alien to me, understanding what people's faith meant to them. That was why I did the anthropology MA. I mean, obviously I'd love to do an MA for every project every project I embark on, but obviously that isn't possible on a number of levels. But for me, it was about time, and it was about commitment. And I think also the way I really hope that I work in a kind of thoughtful way, and it's really important to me that people I photograph, even though they're not people I can relate to on one level. So for instance, when I was photographing pilgrims, this concept of pilgrimage at that point was quite foreign to me, but it's very important when I'm photographing people that there's this trust established, and that there's this level of respect and kind of dignity there. And sometimes that comes through long conversations. Sometimes that comes through not taking a photo for days. Sometimes I'd go to Lourdes and I would sit for days and not take a single image. So it's about patience for me, and trust is key, particularly photographing communities that are not always easy to kind of access.
Absolutely, yeah. Another question, how much does your background in anthropology influence your choice of subjects? It leads quite nicely onto what I've just said.
So the anthropology, well, I studied English literature originally, and I think that influences me in that it just makes me open to the world, and I'm very kind of curious, and I often have ideas and I'll write them down, and kind of from literature and poetry, and those definitely influence me. But the reason I did the anthropology MA was because the project wasn't working. So ex voto for me wasn't working as a project, and I thought part of that might be because I didn't have this kind of spiritual connection with the people at that point, with the people in place that I was photographing. And I found this MA that was the only MA of its kind, which was an MA in the anthropology of travel, tourism and pilgrimage. So it was specifically about pilgrimage. So that then meant that I was at SOAS doing my MA, I was reading about theories of pilgrimage, I was in seminars, I was in lectures, I was very much immersed in this world of thought and of research. So that then kind of almost gave me credibility for myself. And I ended up writing my dissertation, my MA dissertation, about being in Lourdes and about phenomenology, which is a whole other kind of conversation. But it definitely, I mean, I don't know how the project would have developed without that MA, but it really did enrich how I thought about my subjects.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so we'll lead to one last question, which is what's next?
Oh no, I hate this question because I'm always like, I haven't finished this thing yet. Okay, so the book, I have the new book, Gli Isolani, which I have here, is just out in the next couple of weeks, really. So this has 50 images from the project that I've shown you, from the Italian project. So that's been a bit of a labour of love. And then next is the documentary feature film about Vera, who is the Orthodox nun I met during Ex Voto. And that's a whole other conversation as well about the difference between photography and filmmaking, because it's been a very steep learning curve for me. But I am co-directing, so I'm not making this on my own. But that was a subject she was a subject who I just couldn't let her go. She was just so incredible, and her stories, I mean, she's just this extraordinary woman, and I knew from the first moment I met her that she had something about her. And then this has now been 4 years in the making, so hopefully the film Mother Vera, which is a documentary feature film, fingers crossed, will be out next year. So that's what I'm concentrating on at the moment. And then I've got notebooks full of ideas, but some may happen, some may not. I'm trying not to put too much pressure on myself at the moment.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Look forward to seeing the film. Thank you so much to you and Louise for tonight's talk, and thank you everyone for coming. Massive thank you as well to Huckleberry, our partners for this talk as well. Thank you everyone. I hope you have a pleasant evening, and we'll see you hopefully at the next PhotoForum.